Very good afternoon to you. You're watching BBC News 24. We'll be bringing you all the pictures live from that fuel depot fire near Hemel Hempstead throughout the course of the afternoon and evening here on BBC News 24. This is the scene live at the moment. The fire still raging. Some people saying more intensively than it was at the time of the first explosions, which happened just after 6 o'clock this morning. There was a series of blasts which could be heard more than 100 miles away. In fact, there were reports that the blast was heard as far afield as France and even Holland. Miraculously, of the 43 people injured, only 2 were seriously hurt. This is one of the first pictures of the fires caught on camera by an eyewitness this morning. Many houses and businesses in the surrounding area were damaged.
This is possibly the largest incident of this kind in peacetime Europe.
43 people were injured, 2 of them seriously. Police said it was surprising that more people weren't hurt. Well, a huge plume of black smoke is now moving eastwards, and people in its path have been warned to keep windows closed and to stay indoors. Traffic chaos for many. The M1 is closed to traffic between junctions 6 and 10. There are queues at petrol stations, but the police have been telling the public not to panic buy. Well, that's our main news story this afternoon. If you want any more on that, you can get it on our interactive news service, BBC I, either on Freeview here or on digital satellite. Just press that red button and follow all the on-screen instructions. Well, at a press conference a little earlier this afternoon, the Director of Public Health for Hertfordshire, Dr. Jane Halpin, gave advice to residents worried about the after effects of today's explosions.
Concerns that people may have about the plume of smoke, they should apply common sense. Stay indoors, keep the doors and windows closed. That's the best thing that people can do to not expose themselves to the smoke. The smoke's probably made up of things called hydrocarbons, which I won't go into detail about, but the potential health effects, particularly in the short term, are really only likely to affect people who already have respiratory illnesses, such as asthma, such as chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. People with these sorts of conditions who are getting symptoms, the symptoms they're likely to be getting are things like coughing, wheezing, further shortness of breath. If people do get exposed and do have these symptoms, as has already been said, if the symptoms are minor and they want advice and reassurance, they should contact NHS direct. They should continue to take their usual medication. If they are not reassured by this or concerned, their GP out-of-hours service should be able to help them. However, if people do experience extreme shortness of breath or are in an emergency situation, clearly that's what their local hospitals are there for, but they're not really there for people who need that advice and reassurance. We have got work in hand to sample the smoke to be clearer about exactly what's in it and what it's made up of. And really we need to know more about this before we can understand what long-term implications there may be, if any, from this exposure. However, what I would restate is that those people who are most at risk are those people who have inhaled the smoke. So clearly, if you are worried and you've inhaled smoke, that's one thing. If it's a question of simply seeing the plume, although it may be quite frightening, it probably simply at a distance poses very little risk. The closer you are to these things, the more worried you are, and distance dilutes greatly the effects of this type of pollution.
That was Dr. Jane Halpin, the Director of Public Health for Hertfordshire. What are the health implications of this explosion? Let's look into it in a bit more detail with our health correspondent, Jane Draper. Interesting that they were saying, obviously, they were still sampling the smoke here, Jane. I mean, they can't absolutely guarantee that this smoke is non-toxic, can they?
That's right. I mean, they think at the moment it's of low toxicity, but they are still doing a lot of work to find out exactly what is in that plume. And we heard there the mention of hydrocarbons. Now, these are chemical compounds which are worked on in oil depots like this one, and the concern is that they could affect people, could cause respiratory problems. And the experts from the Health Protection Agency, who usually look at infectious diseases, but they also have a role analysing poisonous hazards, things like this. So they're looking very closely at what's in the plume and whether there's any particular risk from these chemical compounds.
People have been told immediately under the path of this plume to stay indoors and keep their windows closed. But I suppose the risk, the fear will be that when those particles do fall to the ground, which inevitably they must do, that is the moment of greatest danger for people underneath.
That's right. People will feel worried, particularly if they have this plume over their house at the moment. They are, of course, being told to stay indoors, keep the windows closed. I think the main people that need to just monitor their own health are, as we've heard, people who might be elderly and might have respiratory problems generally, also people with asthma, and they need to just be aware as to whether they're feeling any extra tightness in their chest or any extra coughing, for example.
And those people, perhaps the solution for them would be to take oxygen or something like that. But if you are an asthmatic, you would know what to do in these situations.
Yes, these people are being told to take their usual medication, but if they experience any extra problems, to contact their doctor, to contact NHS Direct. It has to be said the local health service has had some calls. They have had people ringing them, asking for advice. They've not been inundated. There's no sign of panic at the moment or any widespread health problems. But the health authorities are on standby in case there are longer term effects. And the Department of Health is keeping an eye on the whole situation, but they say that at the moment their emergency planning teams are happy that this is being handled very well locally and that there is the local capacity.
What about young children? Are they more at risk? Should parents be more concerned perhaps about young children who might have been out playing this morning?
Well, if they inhaled the smoke, then their parents need to be aware if they develop coughing or wheezing or any sort of symptoms of those sort, then they should contact the doctor, contact the health service, and particularly, again, if they are asthmatic.
Okay. Jane, thank you very much indeed with that update. It's believed that some 2,000 people have been evacuated as a result of those blasts, which have continued throughout the course of the morning. We were just seeing there some live pictures. Dusk has fallen now over the Buncefield terminal, but you can see from those live pictures that the flames are still burning intensely. In fact, some people are suggesting more intensely than they were earlier on this morning when those explosions first occurred just after 6 o'clock. Well, a short time ago, the Chief Constable of Hertfordshire Police gave the latest on the operation.
Given the latest information on the fire is likely to continue for the next 24 hours or so, but clearly that is a moving picture and the Chief Fire Officer will give you a fuller briefing on that. That does mean, however, potentially extended disruption in the Hemel Hempstead area of Hertfordshire. In regard to this, we will try and keep our families and communities informed of the latest update, but at this point it's likely that schools in and around Hemel Hempstead will be closed tomorrow, and we would urge parents to check in regard to local schools, ideally through the Hearts Direct website, which is www.heartsdirect.org. If I can repeat that, www.heartsdirect.org. But also we'll try and pass the information out on local radio, and schools themselves will try and ring parents. It's likely also that libraries and day centres around the area will be affected at least tomorrow. If I just very briefly recap on the events, the emergency services were contacted just after 6 a.m. this morning following reports of a series of explosions in the Buncefield area. Indeed, there have been further explosions during the course of the day. These were expected, and it is still possible that there will be further explosions on the site. But clearly the fire service will shortly give you a full update from their perspective. There were a number of staff at the depot at the time of the incident, and I'm pleased to say that we can now report they have all been accounted for. However, we will continue to run a casualty bureau, and that number is 0800 096 0095. And if I can repeat that, 0800 096 0095 for those who are concerned about people who were on the site. If ringing from overseas, the number is 0207 158 0125. In terms of an update on casualties, to date we believe 43 people have been seen who have sustained injuries, and I would emphasise that the vast majority of these are not serious injuries. All we believe bar 2 people have now been discharged, but clearly that situation can still change as the day goes on and people report to hospitals. One of the main concerns at the moment remains the very thick plume of smoke which continues to spread across the county. The contents of that smoke are clearly an irritant. It can make people cough, irritate their eyes, make them feel nauseous, and clearly for people who already have asthma and breathing difficulties, they will need to be especially careful. The advice has got to be and has got to remain, please keep out of the plume of smoke, stay indoors, close your windows and tune into local radio and television. If people are feeling unwell as a result of exposure to the smoke, please ring the NHS Direct on 0845 4647. That's NHS Direct on 0845 4647. Clearly, if people are feeling acutely unwell, then contact your out-of-hours doctor, or in a real emergency, the hospital. But we would really stress in the first instance NHS Direct. We clearly expect there to be continued extensive traffic disruption around the scene, and particularly to the M1 motorway for the immediate future. And again, I would appeal, please, for people not to travel to the area, to avoid the M1, and not to contact the emergency services at the current time unless you really have to do so.
Hertfordshire Chief Constable Frank Whiteley speaking about a couple of hours ago. You saw next to him the plume of smoke coming from the scene of the explosions at Buncefield. Let's just show you the live pictures now, where of course night has fallen, and in the night sky you see those fireballs shooting up into the sky several hundred feet. Each tank at that depot is thought to contain up to 3 million gallons of fuel as a mixture of petrol and aviation fuel held at Buncefield. Half the depot, the 5th largest in the country, is on fire. The other half has been protected, and fire services are there hosing down the other tanks, some of which have been damaged by the actual blast itself in terms of the shock waves, but they've been dosing them down with water throughout the day, trying to prevent those exploding and being caught up in this huge conflagration that we can see going into the night sky now. The tactics, the strategy that fire officers are using is to try and let it burn as much of itself out as possible before putting foam on it, either tonight, or they might do that at daybreak tomorrow. But it's very much a question of letting the fuel burn itself off and then trying to damp down what they can once they can contain it. There have been extremely dramatic eyewitness reports from people who were there just at the time the first explosions happened, just after 6 o'clock this morning. My colleague Joanna Gosling has been speaking to a tanker driver, Paul Turner. He just arrived for work at the depot when the explosion happened.
I got to work this morning about 6 o'clock, pulled into the car park, and was walking up to get in the turnstiles to collect my vehicle, and as I got halfway I just saw a huge ball of flame which must have been all 50 metres across, followed by a huge bang explosion, loudest bang I've ever heard in my life. I'm not sure whether my knees buckled or whether the blast took me off my feet. I was sort of in shock. I just got up, ran back to my car as fast as I could, not really thinking that my car could have been damaged, and I should have actually carried on running out of the building. Jumped in my car, started my car up and got off site as quickly as I could, got to a roundabout, stopped with some other drivers, a couple of BP drivers behind me, and we stopped there, had a look, and we just saw one of the tanks themselves shooting flames 40, 50 feet into the air.
Were you injured at all?
Well, no, I feel fine. I just landed on my backside and just got up and ran, you know. As I said, I'm not sure whether it was my legs that buckled, whether it was the force of the blast, which I did feel, and the building that I was walking next to was shook, the ground shook, and I just got up and scarpered, really.
Could you see where the explosion had actually happened?
It looked like it happened behind the loading racks where the drivers go up to load, where I could have been at 6 o'clock this morning, but for going in yesterday and preloading my vehicle for this morning just to make life easier for myself so I wouldn't have to queue up, because sometimes there can be a bit of a queue for the loading racks because there are Shell drivers, Texaco drivers, Tesco drivers and all sorts of people loading up there. So to avoid that this morning, I preloaded my vehicle yesterday, but I would have been there at 6 o'clock when the explosion happened.
So just describe for us in more detail, if you can. You describe it, you think it was behind the loading racks. What exactly is in that area?
There are 8 to 10 racks where we pull onto the bait and connect hoses to load our vehicles up when we're going to the different petrol stations or schools, farms and that sort of thing. I would say 50 to 100 feet behind that is the first big tank. Now, I don't know if it was that tank that went up, but there are 3 or 4 dotted around that are actually behind that, so it could have been one of them. We just couldn't see from there. So if you were on the loading racks when it went up, I'm just concerned for the drivers, there might have been a bit of trouble there.
It was clearly a catastrophic explosion. We can see the scale of it from our pictures. How much fuel might have been in those tanks at the time?
Well, I've been told that each tank can hold up to 3 million gallons. So that's a hell of a lot of fuel, and I don't see how any firefighters can actually get near to that to fight it, because the heat will be so intense.
They can hold up to 3 million gallons. Would they have been full at that time?
That I don't know. The technicians would know, but they could well have been full at that time. Could well have been.
And we heard earlier that the oil depot itself is actually divided into 2 sections. One is for aviation fuel and the other is for domestic fuel. Was this on the aviation side?
I don't think so. I think it was on the side of the fuel for cars. I don't think it was aviation fuel, because that goes through pipelines. I'm not sure where those tanks are in relation to where the explosion were, but I think it was, as I said, for like the Totals and the pace drivers of this world.
So how much activity would have been going on at that site at the time?
At that time, drivers, barring Total drivers who normally are in and out of there by 5 o'clock, I would have been up there, Texaco drivers would have been up there, Tesco's drivers. Most drivers go up there and load. The shift normally starts about 6 o'clock. So there could have been a few on the loading rack.
And as you were leaving, were the flames already reaching high into the sky? How long did it take to really take hold?
Virtually straight away. By the time it took me to drive a quarter of a mile down to the roundabout, turn around, the flames were shooting up into the air. The first thing I saw was the flames and then the bang, and then more flames after that by the time I got to the roundabout.
Paul Turner speaking to Joanna a little earlier this morning, who was there, of course, at the time of the explosions. Let's just bring you some breaking news, really, suggesting regarding John Prescott, the Deputy Prime Minister, who's been to look at the scene. He's just released this statement saying he's been there now, met the emergency services at police headquarters at Welwyn Garden City. He just said that he was impressed with the response from the emergency services. The major incident plans, he said, were set up promptly and were working properly. He offered central government help, but was told that the emergency services didn't need any extra help at the moment and were coping with the situation. So the Deputy Prime Minister John Prescott has just been to the scene. He's offered central government help, but everything seems to be working according to plan, and he was told by Hertfordshire that at the moment they didn't need any extra help since they were coping with the situation. You're watching BBC News 24. The time now is just coming up to 10 to 5. Let's have a look at the latest pictures and indeed our main story. Let's just remind you of that. The Hertfordshire Fire Chief says that the explosions which ripped through the oil depot were probably the biggest incident of its kind in peacetime Europe. 2 people are in hospital with serious injuries. 37 others have been treated for minor injuries. Throughout the course of the day, a huge plume of black smoke, which can be seen from space, is moving eastwards. Police have warned people to stay indoors, especially those who are, of course, under the immediate path of that plume. Well, throughout the course of the afternoon, we've been speaking to Jeff Daniels. He's an engineer and expert on the fuel industry. And Jeff, it's now remarkably, nearly 11 hours since those first explosions. And when you look at those flames still coming from the fuel depot, how much longer do you think that that's going to burn for?
Well, we've already heard the fire chief say that he doesn't anticipate even starting to attack this fire until tomorrow morning. So we've got another 18 hours of it. And putting it out is going to be a very long job, assuming he gets it right first time. Which we all hope he does. I'm astonished by these scenes now. It always looks worse once night has fallen, but I can't remember seeing anything quite like that since wartime days when we used to look out across the east end of London after a heavy air raid. That's the sort of scale of it. It really does look tremendous.
The fire officer saying, I mean, the largest incident in peacetime Europe, but each tank, though, containing, we believe, 3 million gallons of fuel. How long would it take, do you think, for that to burn out ordinarily? I mean, is there any trial, anything that's been done on this?
I suspect this is way beyond the experience of anybody in the oil industry, in Europe at least. The answer is, of course, it's a variable. You can't measure it. It depends how intense the fire is. It depends over how large an area it spreads. You know, both of those things will mean that the fuel gets used up a bit quicker. But as you say, 3 million gallons per tank, and there are 26 tanks on site. We're led to believe that is an awful lot of fuel, even assuming that some of them were empty or half empty. But as we can see, as you said, nearly 12 hours after it started, it looks like that. It's going to look like that tomorrow morning. And with a bit of bad luck, it's going to look like that tomorrow evening as well.
Just explain the layout of a depot like Buncefield. We're told it's the 5th largest. You think, what, 26, 28 tanks there. Are they all independent of each other, or are they all linked by a central fuel line?
Well, they have to be linked by lines to get the product in and out of the tanks,
of course,
obviously. But they are isolated from each other as far as possible. Standard procedure in any place like this is to have each tank standing on its own, surrounded by earth walls, whose purpose is mainly to contain any fuel spillage, but also to contain any fire if it breaks out. Any one tank going on fire shouldn't set any of the others on fire. But in this case, it looks as though the explosion that started the whole thing was so huge that it literally jumped those defences and spread the fire over a big area to begin with.
Okay, Jeff, and as you were saying earlier on, remarkable that there weren't more casualties, let alone fatalities. In fact, Hertfordshire Ambulance Service has been giving the latest on the casualties at a press conference a little earlier on.
We received calls from this emergency just after 6 o'clock this morning. Because of the information we gleaned at that time, the ambulance service declared a major incident standby status, and that moved the health community into a major incident arrangement. We alerted the surrounding hospitals in Bedfordshire and Hertfordshire of that status, and those hospitals also enacted their plans. Surrounding ambulance services were also contacted, and 4 ambulance services had resources ready should we have needed them. Thankfully, at this present time, no casualties were in a life-threatening condition, and of the casualties taken to hospital, only 1 patient at this time is not of a fairly minor nature. 43 casualties have been dealt with by the health system to date, and most of those are at Hemel Hempstead General Hospital and the Watford General Hospital. The ambulance service has dealt with 9 casualties, and we've had further emergency calls during the day to people in the Hemel Hempstead area who've been affected by this emergency. Our GP colleagues have also dealt with just under 50 patients who've presented themselves or telephoned through the normal channels. We've also assisted our police colleagues who needed some specialist intervention about breathing difficulties from the scene. So far the emergency's been dealt with very well by the health community, and I'm pleased to say that all of the arrangements we have at this time worked extremely well on this occasion.
Well, that was Oskin Edwardson from Bedfordshire and Hertfordshire Ambulance Service. So speaking at that press conference a little earlier on this afternoon, there's been evidence of some people buying extra petrol since news of the explosions broke. These people concerned that there may be shortages following those blasts. The government says it's too early to say exactly what the effects of the fire will be on the supply of fuel. Let's speak to our business correspondent, Patrick Bartlett, who joins me again in the studio now. I mean, are they able to guarantee that this won't have any effect whatsoever, Patrick?
No, they can't guarantee that. There may well be some short-term difficulties in getting fuel to where it's needed. But I mean, what they're pointing out is that no refinery capacity has been affected. So there's no actual shortage of fuel. It's just a case of transporting it to where it's needed. Now, Buncefield supplied a very large area of the southeast. So the focus now is on as I understand it, they're rolling out a contingency plan. The government's being kept informed. The oil companies are redeploying drivers from Buncefield to other terminals such as Tilbury, Corriton in Essex, Forley near Southampton, and also the terminal up at Northampton.
We were speaking to Ray Holloway a little earlier on, and he was saying the advice to drivers is please don't panic buy. This is going to cause more problems. What about the aviation industry, though? Will it have any effect on that?
Well, the aviation industry, I mean, we're talking mainly about Heathrow and Luton. I think Heathrow relies for about a third of its fuel from Buncefield, but it says it's got 48 hours supply on site, and it's no doubt making contingency plans to bring in more from Forley in Southampton. But if the worst comes to the worst, of course, a lot of short-haul flights can refuel on the continent, and they may already be making provision for that to enable the supplies they've got on site to last a little longer. So at this stage, I don't think there's any particular concern that flights will be affected.
Buncefield was operational, I think, in the late 1960s, 1968, I've read. But when you look at how few casualties there were in this, is that because all these depots now are so intensively automated that really there are very few people on site at any time of the day, let alone at 6 o'clock in the morning?
Well, this was originally, as I understand it, a military depot, so it's built to a fairly high spec. It's supposedly in pretty good condition, but it's also highly automated, as you say, and I understand that there are only 9 people working on site at any one time, although there would have been a number of drivers in the area as well. But of course this happened in the early hours of Sunday morning, perhaps the time when fewest people would have been around. Of course there weren't many people or hardly anybody on the industrial estate nearby. So the area was relatively empty, and I think that may well be one reason why there were so few serious casualties.
OK, well that is the one piece of good news from today's explosions. Patrick, thank you very much indeed. Flames still burning at Buncefield, as we've been seeing from the live pictures throughout the day. That smoke still spreading eastwards over London, heading towards Europe. Let's get the very latest on the weather now and those wind speeds and directions from Darren.
Thanks very much, Tim. Well, so far we've had a very light northerly wind. I think by the morning the wind still northerly will be a little bit stronger, and we could well have a bit of rain around as well. Following that, we're back to square one, really sunny and cold right the way across the country. As well as the fog, as well as the smoke, we've got some fog across southern parts of the UK. That will thicken for a time, but lift later in the night as the thicker cloud and patchy rain drifts southwards. And behind it, we get a frost for Scotland and for Northern Ireland. Here's the morning picture, though. Damp, drizzly weather across the southeast. That'll wash out some of that smoke. Following on from that, we'll see the sunshine coming out across northern England and across Scotland and Northern Ireland. Big change in the weather here after a record-breaking mild night last night. Across some parts of Scotland, it will start cold and frosty, but plenty of sunshine. Grey and damp start, though, across southern parts of England. That will clear the south coast by lunchtime, lingering through the Channel Islands. Sunshine following elsewhere, but a colder feel right the way across the country. Not quite so cold for Tuesday and Wednesday. More cloud, and we'll see a bit of rain for Scotland and Northern Ireland.
You filming? Ready? Go.
Are you ready for Christmas?
Peter says no.
Shall we mingle? I said stuff it.
You just love Christmas.